In cinema, literature, and pop culture, few time periods are as beloved as medieval England. It has inspired countless films, video games, festivals, and even fantasy epics like George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, which draws heavily from English medieval history. However, this popularity has also given rise to several misconceptions about the era. Medieval peasants supposedly bathed only once in their lives. Everyone was dead by 35, never having left their village. Only the monarchy and the church held any rights. Well, there's some truth to these notions. Life in medieval England wasn't entirely what you might expect. And today, let's explore a few reasons why. Cleanliness and livelihood. One of the most common misconceptions about medieval people is that they were constantly filthy and lacked all sense of hygiene or table manners, especially the bloody peasants. They're often imagined as never practicing self-care, letting their hair and beards grow wild and smelling perpetually of manure. In films, even kings are shown tearing into shared platters of meat with their bare hands, emphasizing supposedly grotesque attitudes toward propriety. Of course, we're not going to pretend hygiene met modern standards, as it didn't, and disease was absolutely rampant, but evidence from medieval English etiquette guides show that people followed clear rules for basic dining manners. These included washing one's hands before and after eating, avoiding the return of touched food to shared dishes, refraining from touching one's nose or ears at the table, and swallowing food before drinking from a communal cup. Which is a bit gross, isn't it? A communal cup? Likewise, everyone was expected to at least top and tail daily or wash their face, underarms, and privates. Poorer peasants and those in rural areas often took quick dips in nearby rivers or wiped themselves down with a wet cloth. Those with a bit more means kept jugs and bowls at home, heating water over the hearth. Meanwhile, townsfolk and city dwellers often had access to public bathhouses, which served not just as places to bathe, but also socialize, play games, eat, and drink. Bathhouses offered patrons oils, and for the wealthier, tallow soap to clean themselves more thoroughly. The nobility, on the other hand, typically had private bathtubs in their homes and would top and tail at least twice a day. Their tubs were stocked with personal oils and soaps, and like the bathhouses, privacy was of little concern. Nobles often conducted business, drank, and chatted with friends while bathing, and even performed hand-washing ceremonies involving scented water poured over their hands. Even more surprising was the widespread practice of dental care across all social classes. Peasants without means would chew the ends of fresh hazel twigs until they became bristle-like, creating a makeshift toothbrush. Those unable to do even that used a piece of linen cloth to scrub their teeth clean. Many also crushed mixed herbs into liquids to make mouthwash. For a primitive toothpaste, sea salt and ground herbs such as cloves were commonly blended together or steeped to create a rinse. Gross. While peasants often relied on simple chewed twigs as toothpicks, nobles carried intricately designed ones made of gold or silver. And when it came to hair care, nearly everyone owned a comb, even if they carved it themselves. Double-sided combs were popular, with one side featuring fine teeth, ideal for removing parasites. Nobles would even pay attendants to wash their hair occasionally, as it was believed that washing too frequently could cause head colds. Between washes, perfumed oils were used for fragrance, while flaxseed oil served as a kind of hair gel. Although certain items, such as mirrors, were reserved for the wealthy, most tools for ear cleaning, shaving, tweezing, and nail trimming were accessible to everyone with differing quality and materials. Everyone also owned at least 3 sets of clothing made from 2 main fabrics, linen and wool. While the wealthy enjoyed greater variety in style, color, and quality, even the poorest individuals typically had at least 2 sets of linen underclothes that were regularly washed and rotated, along with a thicker wool garment for outerwear. Linen was also used for bedsheets, and many people of the era slept naked between them, washing and changing them often. Although fleas, lice, and other parasites were common and people believed they spontaneously arose from dirt, alright then, most still tried to manage them using natural repellents such as lavender and cedarwood. You've probably already heard of today's sponsor, Holzcomb, before. I've worn their watches before in a bunch of videos, and they're just fantastic. They make small batch timepieces and jewelry out of actual natural materials, wood, stone, even things like peacock feathers. It sounds a bit out there, but then you put one on and you realize that it's just a really beautiful way of making watches. It's unique, and it just looks nice. This one on the black strap I also find particularly fantastic. They just don't feel mass-produced. Every piece is just a little bit different because of the natural materials. This week, they're running their biggest sale of the year, Holzcomb's Black Week, now through December the 1st. You could get up to 30% off, but only by clicking the link in the description below or in the pinned comment, so it's a limited time thing. Maybe you've been eyeing something for yourself, or you need a gift that's not just another forgettable Amazon purchase. We've all been there. This is your window. Also, they ship worldwide from Vienna, and if you're you're in the US, they handle all of the custom stuff for you, so there's no drama. It ships about 5 to 9 days. Again, there's links below, or you can just go to holscombe.com/sideprojects. The sale ends on December 1st. Now back to today's episode. Because of the generally poor hygiene and harsh living conditions of the time, it's long been claimed that the average life expectancy in the Middle Ages was only 35. However, this figure is highly misleading due to extremely high infant mortality rates. For those who survived childhood, the average life expectancy was closer to 51 years, and as with modern averages, many lived well beyond that into their 60s, 70s, even their 80s, just as today's global life expectancy of 72 doesn't mean centenarians are unheard of. During the 12th and 13th centuries, for instance, William Marshall, often hailed as the greatest knight who ever lived, continued fighting in battle until the ripe old age of 70. Nobility and peasantry. Now, we often imagine that in medieval England, one was either a wealthy noble or a destitute peasant with little opportunity for physical or social mobility among the lower classes. In reality, there were multiple types of peasants, along with others who didn't fit neatly into either category. Peasant simply meant farmer, and most were serfs. Across medieval Europe, roughly 70% of the population were thought to be serfs, people legally tied to the land they worked, which was inherited by the lord of the manor. Yet even this position came with certain rights. While serfs couldn't leave the land without their lord's permission, their lords also couldn't simply evict them. Beyond serfs, there was also a smaller class of free peasants who owned and managed their own land. Meanwhile, traders, craftsmen, and other similar professions weren't considered peasants at all, instead forming their own separate class. A landlord, meanwhile, wasn't always a noble. In many areas, the church owned large estates with abbeys and cathedrals functioning as local manors, overseeing the administration of nearby towns and villages. More surprisingly, some peasants became prosperous enough to purchase surrounding plots of land, effectively becoming landlords themselves and employing other peasants and even serfs. One such example was Thomas Collins, who, according to court records, by the 1270s had amassed around 15 acres of land, along with livestock that included cattle, sheep, and geese. His wife supplemented their income by brewing beer for sale, pointing to a comfortable peasant lifestyle. Collins was also well respected and influential enough to serve as a pledge, a person who legally vouched for another's financial credibility, similar to a modern-day co-signer on a loan. Although Collins's fortunes later declined and he fell into debt, his story illustrates the degree to which peasants could rise or fall socially and economically through their own means. It is also common knowledge that medieval peasants never travelled far, living and dying in the same village where they were born. While that was sometimes true, it isn't so different from today, with most modern Britons still living within about 20 miles or 32 kilometres of their birthplace. Yet that doesn't mean medieval peasants never travelled at all. Free peasants could go wherever they wished, while serfs technically needed their lord's permission. In practice, that permission was usually granted easily and seemed more a formality than a restriction. Most villagers travelled at least weekly to local markets to buy and sell goods, while others ventured farther when summoned by their lords for battle. The most common reason for long-distance travel, however, was religious pilgrimage. Many chose nearby holy sites such as cathedrals or abbeys, but others journeyed as far as Rome, Constantinople, or even Jerusalem. Lacking horses, most peasants made these long treks on foot, covering about 15 miles a day, meaning some pilgrimages took months or even years. At their destination, travelers would purchase small souvenirs to prove that they had completed the journey, such as tin badges or inexpensive relics like bits of cloth said to have been viewed or touched by a saint. In many ways, it wasn't so different from how we collect mementos from vacations today. Travel across medieval England was made easier by surviving Roman roads, raised causeways through marshland, and hard-packed dirt routes formed from constant use. Despite the modern image of bandit-ridden highways, historical records suggest that roads were generally safe and laws even protected travelers. For instance, if a road was blocked, one could legally cross another person's land to bypass it, and even if their crops were damaged, the traveler couldn't be held liable. At the same time, depictions of medieval England, especially in film, often show a uniformly white population, implying that few outsiders found their way to the land, with rare exceptions like a chew from Robin Hood men in tights. In reality, England was far more diverse and well-travelled. Cities regularly hosted people from distant regions such as India, Arabia, and West Africa who traded goods and often integrated into English society. In 2021, researchers from the Museum of London and Michigan State University analysed the remains of 41 plague victims from East Smithfield Cemetery in London. Their findings were remarkable. Around 30% of the individuals were of non-white descent, with several showing mixed ancestry, all clear evidence that medieval England was far more multicultural than commonly portrayed. With travel being relatively common, peasants earning wealth, moving around, and exploring the world happened far more often than we tend to imagine. Likewise, while marriages among the peasantry still took into account the economic benefits of a union, most people were free to marry whomever they chose. After marriage, women were generally seen as partners in running the household and contributing to the family's income. While men worked the land, women often wove textiles or brewed beer to sell at market. Mothers with young children typically stayed at home to care for them, but women could still take on outside work if they wished, like running shops, serving as landladies in taverns, or working in a lord's manor. Land and finances could also be passed down to women to keep property within the family, and children were expected to contribute to daily chores such as tending animals, helping with housework, or working in the fields. For those with enough wealth and connections, a child could even be apprenticed to a master craftsman, offering a path to a better life than that of a simple farmer. Of course, while the life of a medieval noble wasn't harder than life of peasants, it came with its own burdens, many of which ordinary people never faced. The nobility ranged from the monarchy at the top to dukes, earls, and lesser-ranking knights. Below them were the gentry, landowning gentlemen or poor knights without noble blood, often granted their titles for military service or other acts of loyalty. Most nobles were bound to the land granted to their family and in return owed unwavering allegiance to the king. They were expected to maintain peace within their territories, serve as royal advisors, and lead troops in times of war. Noble boys began military training as young as 7, learning swordsmanship and discipline, and many saw their first battles in their early teen years. Peasants, on the other hand, were summoned to fight based on their size and ability, meaning young boys were typically spared until they were at least 16. Although brutal and bloody, warfare for peasants was often straightforward, as they were either killed in battle or allowed to return home afterward. Nobles, however, faced the constant threat of capture by enemy lords seeking ransom, a common way for the medieval elite to profit during war. Captured nobles could spend months or even years in captivity while their families negotiated payment for their release. Wealthier nobles, whose ransoms promised large rewards, were often treated well, fed properly, given comfortable quarters, and even permitted to walk their captors' grounds under supervision. Poorer nobles and low-ranking knights, however, were less fortunate and were sometimes thrown into dungeons to await ransom. If their families couldn't pay, they risked extended imprisonment, property seizure, or public disgrace. Even those eventually released often returned home financially ruined and struggling to rebuild their estates. Such debts could lead to further problems. As local lords, nobles were responsible for collecting taxes, keeping a portion to fund their own estates while sending the rest to the crown. Though some nobles lived lavishly, many fell deep into debt due to the immense cost of maintaining their titles and households. During wartime, they were expected to equip and pay their armies, including arming peasants who couldn't afford their own weapons. They also had to maintain large staffs, care for their lands, and fund the upkeep of their castles. Hosting tournaments and feasts, a key part of noble life, was another major expense, as nobles were expected to pay for everything, from food to entertainment to prizes for the champions. For landless or poor knights, these tournaments were often their main source of income, as they could win prize money or ransom captured opponents just like in war. Beyond their financial burdens, nobles also acted as local administrators, performing many of the functions of a modern town hall. They organized peasants to maintain roads, clear forests, and repair public structures. Marriages among nobles, however, were almost always political, arranged by parents years in advance to strengthen alliances and wealth without threatening family influence. Love rarely entered the equation there. Even the matter of children could create tension, as land and titles were inherited solely by the eldest son, leaving younger sons and daughters with fewer prospects. This has often led to bitter rivalries, civil conflicts like the Wars of the Roses, and even assassinations of heirs seen as political threats, such as the infamous case of the princes in the Tower. For a noble, one's fate was largely fixed at birth, determined not by ability or ambition, but by the order in which one happened to be born. Religion and free thought. Most people know that the Catholic Church dominated medieval England until Henry VIII's Reformation in 1534. However, this often creates an image of an oppressive institution that used its power to solely control the masses until England finally broke free to think for itself. In truth, the situation was far more complex. The church functioned as more than just a landowning authority to be feared. While it's true that most people were expected to pay a tithe, this amounted to roughly 10% of a peasant's agricultural output rather than direct monetary payment as we might imagine today. Of course, regular attendance at church services was expected every Sunday and during major religious festivals, of which there were between 40 and 50 each year. Officially, failing to attend could result in fines, public penance, or even refusal of confession. In practice, however, the church recognized that such strict adherence was just unrealistic. Certain professions like fishing required people to be away for long stretches of time, and nearly every parish had a few known non-attenders who faced no real consequences. They weren't labeled heretics or ostracized, it was simply accepted that they couldn't be there. Children, meanwhile, weren't expected to attend church until puberty, though younger ones were often brought along simply because their parents had no one to watch them. Because nearly everyone participated in church life, churches also served as vital centers of the local economy, community, and social life. Many even organized separate groups for young men, young women, and married women, allowing locals to meet and interact with peers outside of work. Much like the nobility, churches and abbeys were also significant landowners throughout medieval England, and those overseeing villages or communities carried responsibilities similar to any other landlord. Likewise, both the clergy and their houses of worship ranged widely in wealth, from the lavishly prosperous to those struggling to afford even basic upkeep. Unlike the nobility, however, the church also served as the largest community outreach system in medieval Europe, regularly distributing food and money to the poor. Many religious orders of the time were additionally responsible for running local hospitals and caring for the sick. At the same time, scholarly pursuits were largely reserved for members of the clergy, who became the foremost authorities in education, literature, science, mathematics, and more. During the Middle Ages, several English scholars rose to prominence, perhaps most notably Roger Bacon. Bacon, an English Franciscan friar, championed the use of observation and experimentation, laying early groundwork for what would become the scientific method. He conducted extensive studies on optics and the refraction of light through lenses, research that likely contributed to the invention of spectacles not long after. He was also the first European to accurately record the formula for gunpowder and describe its properties, knowledge he likely gained after examining a Chinese firecracker imported from the Mongol Empire. However, the church also had its dissenters, even during the medieval period when it was supposedly unquestioned by the masses. In the 14th century, Catholic priest and Oxford scholar John Wycliffe stirred controversy with his radical views on faith and reform. He began advocating for changes within the church, including producing a Bible written and read in English rather than the traditional Latin, so that common people could understand the scriptures and even learn to read. What a concept! Wycliffe also criticized many of the church's practices of the era, such as the veneration of saints and relics, private confessions, and the selling of indulgences, among others. In his view, the church had strayed from its true purpose, and the clergy should focus more on the direct word of God in the Bible rather than on what he saw as superstitious interpretations and man-made traditions entirely fabricated by the church. Over the following years, Wycliffe's teachings gained traction among both peasants and nobles, including members of parliament who saw similar reform in England. By 1401, the church and the crown had grown alarmed by the growing movement, whose followers they called lollards, and passed the De Heretico Comrabendo, or the On the Burning of Heretics Act. Under this law, more than 100 people were executed for heresy, including nobles such as Sir John Oldcastle, who was allegedly hanged and then burned. While the act succeeded in quelling open rebellion, the seeds of reform had already been planted. The church's harsh response only deepened resentment, driving the Lollards underground. A century later, when the English Reformation began, many in England welcomed it, remembering the early efforts of those who had already tried to free themselves from the authority of the Catholic Church. However, these kinds of revolutionary and independent thoughts were not limited to nobility and clergy, with peasants also refusing to accept their assigned lot in life. Following the Black Death, England's population had been greatly reduced, and those who remained working the land began to recognize their true value to society. By 1381, many peasants were demanding higher wages and better working conditions. In response, the government passed a law restricting wage increases and took it a step further, introducing a poll tax, which was something used to fund wars or cover deficits. Many peasants, particularly those in Essex, viewed this as a direct affront and refused to pay, standing up to the officials sent by the crown to collect. Before long, these tensions erupted into revolts, spreading throughout southeastern England. The main leader of these was a peasant named Wat Tyler, a man who believed that all people held universal rights and that the peasants deserved fair pay for their labor. He was joined by John Ball, a preacher who shared his principles and argued that they were supported by the Bible. As Ball famously put it, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then a gentleman? The implication being that the natural Christian order should not assign innate superiority to any group of people. Together, Tyler, Ball, and other like-minded individuals rallied an army and launched the Peasants' Rebellion, marching on London and even besieging the city. There they burned the Savoy Palace, home of Prince John of Gaunt. Rather than looting, Tyler's group destroyed the palace's contents to demonstrate their desire to create a new system from the ground up. Shortly afterward, Tyler was killed following a meeting with the 14-year-old King Richard II. Although the rebellion failed to produce lasting reforms, it served as a wake-up call to the nobility, who realized that peasants were more than mere property. They were human beings that constituted the majority of the population. It was also the last time a poll tax would be attempted in England until Margaret Thatcher's administration reintroduced it in the late 1980s, which unsurprisingly received the same backlash that King Richard's tax had 6 centuries earlier, leading to protests and rioting. Events like these highlight not only the sheer scale of the peasantry compared to the nobility in medieval Egypt, but also demonstrate that the land and its people were more than a passive population controlled by the crown and the church. Medieval England proved capable of resisting inequality and injustice, whether against the church or the nobility, and was a place where free thinkers from all backgrounds could begin laying the groundwork for future progress. Thank you for watching.